Gough Whitlam in the Spotlight was brought to you by my lovely patrons Thomas Johnson, James Rapp, Lewis, Henry Kerr, Mike Rann, Neville Rann, and especially John Mezzo for his contribution to today's video. For as little as $3 Australian a month, you can get your name shouted out at the start of every Sawmon video, as well as access to bonus behind the scenes content. In 1972, Australia would finally put an end to 23 years of Liberal country governance with the election of Gough Whitlam, a man whose legacy far outweighs his short tenure in government. But what of this legacy? Was Whitlam truly a reformer who created the modern Australia, or was he an incompetent buffoon who created a period of chaos that Australia quickly put behind them in 1975? Whitlam is often remembered as that Prime Minister that got dismissed by the Governor-General, but his legacy goes much further beyond that. When he first got elected to Parliament in 1953, Whitlam represented a new breed of Labour parliamentarians. No longer was the Labour Party a party of miners and unionists, it now had affluent small L liberals who wanted social change just as much as economic change. As someone who too came from a more affluent background than the average Australian, I find Whitlam's background relatable and appreciate that even though I am not a member of the working class, I can still be a strong supporter of them. As the 50s turned to the 60s, Whitlam's rise to political juggernaut was already apparent when he became Deputy Leader of the Labour Party in early 1960, disrupting a Labour leadership filled with former ministers from Curtin's wartime government. I'm going to be blunt, Caldwell was not a good leader for the Labour Party to run with through the 60s. His old-school Labour policies were not all that attractive to regular Australians, and the party suffered for it. If you want a modern example, look no further than Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom as another leader who was simply not with the times. Corbyn would stay on as leader and would lead the party through 3 elections, in which it would receive a continual worsening results. It was only after destroying the Federal Labour Party's image that Whitlam was finally able to take over and attempt to bring the party's fortunes around. Finally, with a modern leader, the Labour Party was able to get the public's support back, almost winning government in 1969, and then finally winning governance in 1972, ending 23 years of coalition rule. With Labour back in power again, Whitlam would engage in massive reforms, the likes of which Australia had never seen. Much notable of this was his reforms to healthcare, something that we take for granted today, but only have to look across the pond in the US to see why such reforms are critical. Along with healthcare, Whitlam also reformed education to make it more accessible to all Australians, including Indigenous Australians who benefited massively from Whitlam's policies, especially when he established the Natives Titles Act, finally giving land back to its traditional owners. However, while Whitlam was able to end the coalition's control of the lower house, he was unable to end their control of the Senate. The coalition still held a Senate majority along with their Democratic Labour Party allies. This allowed the two parties to thoroughly screw over Whitlam's agenda, and combining this with the growing energy crisis due to the Middle East and oil supplies, it made Whitlam's job extremely difficult. It was in these difficulties that Whitlam was forced to go to the polls early in 1974 to dislodge the DLP/coalition's control of the Senate. Despite a sizable backlash due to his ambitious policies, that Whitlam was finally able to crush the DLP and gain 3 seats. However, the coalition had also gained seats, with the remaining seats in the Senate being held by independents who were more sympathetic to the coalition than Labour. Thus, Australia was left in the same position that it was before the election, with the Senate hostile to Whitlam. While I will, for the most part, defend Whitlam's first term in governance due to the waves of critical reforms passed, his second term was worthy of quite the criticism. The loans affair, while not being the only scandal to befall the Whitlam government, was certainly one of the key examples of its incompetence. It was unfortunately a hallmark of a party who had been in opposition for so long that they had little experience when it came to governing. This was also seen more recently with my own state Liberal government when they took over in 2018 after 16 years in opposition. Getting back to 1975, it was in this chaos that we came to arguably the most iconic part of Whitlam's political life, his dismissal. Now, I've covered this in more detail in my 1975 election video, and recommend you watch that for the full breakdown. Suffice to say, while I can understand the argument that Whitlam needed to go, and if he wouldn't call an election willingly, he needed to be forced to, I don't particularly agree with this. We elect our governments to rule for roughly 3 years, and to depose them whenever they stumble during this period is a recipe for chaos. I'll cover Fraser in more detail in my next video, but to see him as some kind of hero saving Australia from an incompetent government rather than the political opportunist that he actually was is kinda dishonest. The reality was the coalition saw a public angry at the government and used their power in the Senate to force an election and seize control. And so would end Whitlam's short yet impactful government. While the Whitlam period was well known for being a chaotic period in Australian history, it is debated whether that was the fault of the Labour government or world events that Whitlam had no control over. In my opinion, like most things, I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. There's a lot of what-ifs that surround Gough Whitlam. What if Whitlam took over the Labour Party before 1966? Could he have won government sooner, before the 70s energy crisis? What if Whitlam had a Senate majority? Could he have implemented his full agenda without parliamentary conflict? And finally, what if Whitlam had never been dismissed? Could he have stayed in the face of a public losing faith in his government? The reality is, we'll never know. But what we do know is that Whitlam will forever remain one of Australia's most iconic Prime Ministers, and I think that statement carries through to my patrons too. John Mezzo states, I think Whitlam was right when he said that his government was the greatest reforming government in Australian history. He dragged Australia forward in so many important things that made a real difference in the course of our country. The list of all these things is too long to mention here, but the main things were undoubtedly the ending of conscription and Australia's involvement in Vietnam, introducing universal healthcare through Medibank, bringing an end to the White Australia policy, abolishing the death penalty, recognising China, various measures promoting equal pay for women, introducing free tertiary education, reducing the voting age to 18, promoting Indigenous land rights, and granting Papua New Guinea independence. Furthermore, watching him speak, he was undoubtedly the most inspiring Australian politician I have ever seen, with a real vision and style of leadership through moral authority I don't know will ever be met. He also showed how Labour leaders can distance themselves from socialism while still presenting bold, progressive and social democratic agendas. However, his obvious downside was his government's economic mismanagement of the 1973 oil crisis and subsequent recession. While he admitted himself it was not handled well, he seemed to not be as interested or have the ability to be a good economic manager in the ways that Menzies and Rudd governments were able to after recessions. His treasury were also distracted with scandals and inept, as proven by the obscene levels of spending and debt until Bill Hayden got the job in 1975, which proved being too little too late. Overall, I think he was a much needed breath of fresh air, whose contributions to public life made Australia's society much more fair and decent. Going over to YouTube, we also have The Barrel giving his take when he says, Gough Whitlam, I believe, wasn't the greatest as he may have had many scandals, however he was a champion of civil rights, education and healthcare, and for that I appreciate him, however he had his problems. So, to sum up, I think my patrons and viewers agree that Whitlam was an important figure in moving Australia forwards and creating the modern state that we have today. But we also agree that he ran a flawed government that would end up hurting his image and would be his downfall. With Whitlam out of the spotlight, we now move our focus onto our 22nd Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser. Like last time, if you too would like your opinions on Fraser read out in these videos, please either comment here in this video or on my Patreon within the next 2 weeks. Until then, I'll see you later.